Welcome to another episode of Self-Wired. This is The Body Keeps the Score Part 3 analysis. We've got a lot to cover in this video. We're going to be talking about the way the environment interacts with genes, trauma and its relation to various diseases, secure adverse attachment theory. So yeah, I'm excited to get into this. What do you think about this section of the book?
It was a very dense read. I think, like part two, this gets even going from part two to now, it gets more in depth into like the physiology underlying traumatic experience. And really what I found most appreciative and interesting of this section, and like we'll get into, is like the etiology of trauma and like understanding how this really manifests and where can we find its root causes. I really appreciate Kolk's he kind of criticizes modern Western allopathic medicine that kind of in essence with pharmaceuticals or more biochemical interventions they're more surface level and they're more just a band-aid more than anything, whereas what Kolk's trying to do and what many practitioners have been trying to do, the side with Kolk's ideas is the fact that trauma is much more, the root cause is more interpersonal and environmental, and but that isn't the case typically in the mainstream narrative of what these things is. It doesn't fit that more reductionist view of how do we go about curing these things, because we want to reduce it. The reductionism is there to try and simplify it and have a solution for it and say, okay, well, we know what works here and we can present a solution to people. But we have, at the same time, we have to continue to understand the true nature of things, and that's kind of what this is an attempt at, and it's a pretty good one. I think it's like the best we have so far, based off of what he's talking about. How do we improving our relationships and improving our connections with our family and friends.
Right. Yeah, it was interesting to hear his point of view, because what Kolk did essentially was write to kind of the head honchos that are creating the DSM-5, the DSMs in general, and that are kind of the leading researchers in this field. And he was trying to point out, look, I've proven, and other studies have proven, that trauma and mental health diseases, as well as physical diseases in your body, are extremely heavily correlated with past trauma. So the strange thing about this was they didn't really want to hear this. They called it clinical intuition, and they didn't want to kind of look at this side of, adverse childhood trauma is correlated with autoimmune diseases, depression, anxiety, drug abuse, COPD, all these things we're going to get into. And for whatever reason, there is a denial of this in kind of the mainstream psychology and the mainstream medical industry.
Yeah, and I would say that it's mainly a denial or almost like a fear of, like opening those floodgates or opening ourselves to, like, it's kind of what we do whenever we're trying to expand our knowledge in general. It's like we have to kind of almost venture out into the unknown. And so it's kind of like, it's difficult and it's kind of troublesome and fearsome in that sense, where we're going out to the unknown, trying to understand, learn more about these things, because there's a potential to where you could be wrong and there could be incorrect, or you could have more bad than good, but I don't think that this is the case here. I think Kolk is very sound in his clinical intuition as well as his reading
Mhm.
of the literature of trauma, and seeing how this plays out, and seeing how it is that the body keeps the score, and um, what is causing trauma in the interpersonal space,
Right.
from that interpersonal level.
Because when it comes down to it, um, a lot of the time the disease model is inept in diagnosing a traumatized person. A severely traumatized person, someone who just came out of the gate, and when they came into the world, they were in all the wrong places. Their parents were abusive, they grew up in a rough neighborhood, and all these things led to events that the child was incapable of processing correctly, and so they're a troublesome individual. These children are, they're diagnosed with bipolar disorder, personality disorders of many kinds, ADHD, depression, anxiety, PTSD. They get the every single disease in the book, and it
Mm-hmm.
fails to go it fails to diagnose the trauma in it of itself. It tries to kind of put a label on it, and like, okay, if we can define this child as having ADHD, we can give it this medication to solve it. If it has depression, we can go about therapy in this way. When in reality, those diseases don't encompass, or those yeah those labels and those diseases don't encompass the adverse childhood experiences and the history of trauma and the environment that the child is in, and therefore it can't go about healing that child, or even that adult, for that matter.
Yeah, and so, and like, we'll dive all into this as we go through, and discuss about these different points of the book in this specific section. So you want me to go ahead and share my screen, and we can go ahead and
Yeah, definitely.
start this bad boy. Um, so let's see here. So yes, welcome to part 3 of The Body Keeps the Score. And the basic concepts that are going to overlay this section is the classic debate of nature versus nurture, but we've termed it, it's nature and nurture, because as we both know, and as people know, just as we learn more about human psychology and of human development, it isn't one or the other. It's never a black and white. It's always a something in between. And so it's nature and nurture. And we'll kind of play between the two as we go through this, understanding both the genetic dispositions, the biologic dispositions that can cause someone to feel, uh, that can cause trauma to appear biologically or physiologically in the brain, but also how the nurture aspect of this, familially, our early relationships and the relationships we maintain throughout our life will affect us as well. And this this is also plays into neuroplasticity, because as we come into this world as children, we have very malleable plastic brains. That's why we're unlike many animals in that sense, because we need care from our caregivers, our parents, for extensive amounts of time, compared to other animals, where they're basically born and they have to fend for their lives almost immediately. They have to, be integrated into the world almost immediately. Whereas we as children we need time to develop and make sense of our environment, and that's both, that could be troublesome in the developmental, early on, but that has obviously paid dividends uh, down the road for us evolutionarily, and um, as well as a society, as social animals.
Right. Yeah. So all these three bullet points here, they're kind of interconnected. You come into the world equipped with certain kind of concrete things, you're going to do, things like we're going to get into kind of the stages of development that Piaget lays out, which is, and one of those aspects is kind of an egocentric vantage point. So, you are focused completely on yourself. We'll get into that more later on. And then um, the nurture aspect, one of the more concrete aspects of your brain is you crave nurture because your survival is dependent on being nurtured. And then you got into the neuroplastic aspects of this, which is your brain is it comes into the world incredibly malleable because the mother nature doesn't necessarily understand what environment you're going to come into when you're in the womb. So it's evolutionarily advantageous to ensure your survival that your brain adapts to whatever environment you find yourself in. So if you're in a loving environment, your brain adapts to that loving environment. A dangerous environment, your brain adapts to that danger. And then the epigenetic aspect is certain genes, in the same way that your brain will mold itself to the environment, certain genes will come online in regards to the environment that you find yourself in. So all these things are kind of interconnect to define the way you develop and the person you will become, and how you respond to trauma, your personality characteristics. All of these things are inextricable when it comes to understanding an individual person.
Yeah. So like going from a child and going throughout your life, and even into having your own children, and producing future generations, you have this certain neural coding that you develop over time, and so that'll make you more inclined to perceive an environment in a similar way or a certain way, and to act in a certain way, because our thoughts underlie our actions. And and it has this reciprocal effect where our actions like instantiate our thoughts and our behaviors more. They kind of play on each other, but you can just see where it starts off in this early period. And so we kind of download this information almost, and that goes into how that goes into our epigenetics. And why that's so important too is because those epigenetic markers can actually get passed to our offspring as as we reproduce. And so then your children are more inclined to physiologically have a certain physiological pattern, or a genetic pattern, as to what genes they express, to whether or not they're hyper reactive in their immune system, for example, or they have a suppressed immune response, whether or not they are more or less neurotic even. That could happen from either how they perceive you to react to stress, but also that DNA that they've inherited from you. So it just goes to show the grandeur of this, how big this implies. Like, this is not just you as an individual, but for your future generations, your children, your grandchildren, so on and so forth. But again, let's start back at the beginning of this. Where this all begins is with the relationship we have with our caregivers. And this is through attachment and attunement. We have this concept of neural Wi-Fi again, because this attunement and how we see our caregivers interact in the world, and not only how they interact in the world, but how they interact with us, that is really setting the stage for our future experiences in life. And so this is such a big part to the it's so big in developmental psychology, obviously, to understand our relationship to our caregivers and to understand how important that is in shaping our brains because again, we have very plastic brains when we're younger, and over time it becomes more and more hardwired and harder to uh, break or switch that coding.
Right. Yeah. These this neural Wi-Fi or mirror neurons. It's kind of one of the things you come equipped into the world with. So babies come into the world with the capacity to read facial expressions, body language, tone of voice. It's you'll see a mother, kind of making faces at its child and cooing to it. All these things because the child understands these things. It can't verbally speak yet, but it knows exactly what's going on emotionally with its mother. So you could see how a mother who's highly stressed or depressed because of that, due to life circumstances or unresolved trauma, uh, the child understands that, and the child feels the the emotion of the mother, because its brain still needs to understand the environment that it's in, even though it's highly underdeveloped. It's still molding itself in order to ensure its own survival. And something that's important when you're attempting to ensure your own survival is to understand the context into which you were born.
Yeah, and ensuring your survival, ensuring your needs are met is, it goes beyond just because this goes back to what we talked about with the hierarchy of needs as well. Obviously, if your physiological needs aren't getting met, then, you're going to be stuck into that state. And so you're going to be, uh, you're going to be more inclined to, continually inhabit this state where you feel as though your basic uh, physiological the things that you demand physiologically are at a lack. And so, you're kind of almost inhibited in that sense to build upon and to achieve those higher order things, because you didn't have this um, ideal, ideal quote, um, developmental process, with your caregivers. And but it goes beyond that as well, to where we go to care and comfort, or to comfort and security, and the emotional attachments as well. um, so if we're not receiving that from our parents at an early age, then we're setting ourselves up for trouble, neurologically, because if we're not getting in tune with these emotions of love, of reciprocating positive emotions, of reciprocating um, healthy physical touch, like Donald Winnicott, who is another developmental psychologist that Colt talks about. He has a line that goes, it's something along the lines of, the psyche, the way the mother holds a child, will determine how well the psyche feels comfortable in its body, in the body of the human being. So, you know, physical touch and being able to integrate all this stuff that comes from those early relationships with our caregivers. And if that's not ideal, if that's misconstrued because they're dealing with something that they've had, a traumatic past that they themselves had from their caregivers, you can see how it just trickles down and goes down the line.
Right. So yeah, it's kind of neuroplasticity it's one of the most amazing aspects of the human brain in general, but it can go south if
Mm-hmm.
the mother isn't properly in tune with its child. And it was interesting to hear you talk about kind of a psychoanalytical approach to this. Adler's inferiority complex was it pulled a lot from. Obviously, they didn't necessarily have the science behind this, but Adler had understood that the relationship with the mother was heavily tied into feelings of inferiority or superiority, or how we would describe it now as secure or insecure attachment. Um, So I mean, this is kind of something that we've known intuitively for a while now, but the science is coming out, and we're kind of deconstructing the biology and the genetic factors that are at play. And obviously, we're going to get into later in the slides the cultural factors that are at play, and how we can kind of shape society to make sure that this earliest relationship that an individual has with its primary caregivers are the best that they can be in order to create individuals in the society that are mentally healthy. Because these stages of development, they don't stop when you say like you're a fully grown adult. They're kind of this is kind of setting the stage for the rest of your life. So this earliest relationship is of the utmost importance. It needs to be laid out in a way that is creating a child that is capable of being in its environment in a healthy way.
Yeah. And well, one way, well, this is kind of a jump here, but one way that they would that you could measure or like understand how someone would come to perceive their environments and perceive certain social situations that they developed from their caregivers or from their past experiences with those caregivers is something called the thematic apperception test. Um, and it was kind of like a Rorschach test, but less ambiguous because it wasn't just like an ink blot. It isn't just like an ink blot because it's still a test, but they give an actual picture that is it has less ambiguous connotations to it. Might have something that seems fairly ominous or on the fringe of violence, or on maybe it's more benevolent or friendly, as in this case where you see an image of a dad with his children and they are working on a car together. But basically the point of this was you show these children a picture like this one that what they showed in the book, and you ask them what's happening in the scenario, what happened before, and what's going to happen after this picture. And in children who in normal children they picked from a local school, it was a local school nearby. They didn't report. They reported fairly benign scenarios, whereas children who had been had witnessed violence and experienced trauma in their family life, they were much more violent in their descriptions, or much more negative in their descriptions of like what was going to happen in these scenarios.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this kid, his story was the car jack is going to come out and it's going to crush the father. And they would get into, and these are young kids, ages like 7 to 12, who are describing incredibly gruesome, horrific events, because like we've gotten into in other videos, their brain has a different chemical set point. You could describe it in that way, or their worldview is one of tragedy is definitely going to happen because tragedy in the past has happened. So these traumatized children they're creating these stories, and they're using their imagination to create a storyline for this picture, but their imagination is essentially hijacked in the same way that a PTSD victim's imagination is hijacked by a traumatic past. So you can extrapolate from the kinds of stories they would tell on these unambiguous pictures of their worldview, and their predictions for the future, and their anxiety levels because of their past trauma.
Yeah, and they couldn't see themselves out of they couldn't see themselves out of a negative scenario. You
Mm-hmm.
know, they couldn't see themselves out of their getting out of their circumstances, which is obviously, not a good quality to have for life, because it's not. At some point you'll come across strife, and that ability to foresee greater circumstances, to construct a plan of action to get yourself to where you want to be. That's obviously a quality, a most desired uh, quality. But with these thematic apperception tests, you could see that traumatized children were not able to formulate um, these ideas and these visions, and as is the case for traumatized adults as well, although the implications of children are much greater, because again, you're in an early stage, you're really setting the grounds for how they're going to perceive the environment in the future, whereas an adult who's a bit for an adult who experiences something traumatic while they're an adult, it's not as quote hardwired into them.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
um, and we're continuing to talk about attachment, attachment theory, and how the relationship with the caregivers is primary, or is key in this sense, to understanding trauma, to understanding its origins and its true nature. This is John Bowlby, who is the founder of attachment theory. Um, and what he formulated were 4 types of attachment that children experience in their relationships with their parents, and that was the secure. And if you got the secure type of attachment, then that's fantastic. You're probably well on your way to success, if not already. Hopefully, you are watching this as a billionaire, because that would be great for our viewing, I'm sure. But if you don't have that, then you have something. You have avoidant, you have anxious, and you have the disorganized attachment strategy. These are the strategies that you, as a child, develop in relation to your caregivers if they are not attending to your needs, or if they're not satisfying your desires to have connections, and satisfying your basic physiological desires up to your more higher order self-actualization desires. If those aren't being met, then you come across these. Avoidant being dealing but not feeling, where you're not expressing your emotional you're not expressing your emotions to your caregivers, because you see that is just futile now, after um, trying to maybe initially, and you either get no response, or they're um, they're just negligent. So that's kind of the dealing but not feeling strategy, and you kind of take things into your own hands. However, you kind of do that at the expense of your um, emotional expression, and your kind of uh, vitality. Almost, you kind of become almost dead. You're dealing, but you're not feeling.
Yeah,
And
you're
you have
numb.
anxious. You're numb. That's a good way to put it as well. And we have anxious and disorganized. Anxious, you're more agitated, and you're more frustrated at trying to get these needs met, but they're never being um, satisfied. And so what that would spell for someone down the road is someone who's maybe more demanding, or someone who's maybe a bit more, quickly to maybe quickly irritable, um, feeling but not dealing. They're more irrational, more erratic, because that's what they'd learned as a child, to kind of get their parents' attention, and get the a way to achieve what they desire from their parents. Disorganized is a bit tricky. You want to hash on, talk a little bit about that one as well. I'll jump in here.
Yeah. With disorganized, this is kind of the more traumatized version of these attachments. And it's pretty obvious from the word. It's again with anxious, it's kind of irrational. They're kind of oscillating between all these different emotions. You can kind of think about someone who is in a situation that's out of their hands. There's chaos going on, and they don't necessarily know how to deal with the chaos. The difference between that and this individual is, like most of us, if something got out of hand, we're in a dangerous situation, we kind of freeze up and we're frantic, we don't necessarily know what to do about it. Once the situation resolves, we would be kind of back to baseline. We would be in our normal we would be at our normal emotional set point. With a disorganized individual, it's kind of this constant manic, not knowing what to do. They're in fight or flight 24/7. And like we got into, all of these different attachment, all these different versions of attachment relate back to the original relationship we had with our primary caregivers. So an interesting statistic regarding this is, with burn victims, the best predictor for whether or not a burn victim develops PTSD is their attachment theory, or whether they believed their primary caregiver. The best predictor is how secure they felt with their primary caregiver. I'll put it that way. So again, like this is we kind of think of these things as the personality of an individual, but they also relate back to the susceptibility of an individual and how likely it is that they may contract some kind of mental health disease down the road as well.
Yeah, it's the disorganized is like it says, fright without solution. And this one, I guess, is kind of while these bottom three are are pathologized in some sense, the disorganized is really difficult because you're really in a place of not knowing. Whereas avoidant and anxious, you have a kind of a set strategy, whereas with disorganized, it's kind of, he relates it at one point as you're scared of your caregiver, or you're at a distance from your caregiver. You're afraid of what they might do, but at the same time you rely on them to meet your needs, to meet your physiological needs, your needs of emotional attachment. So you kind of have to learn to deal with the caregivers that you have. And so when you have to deal with the caregivers that you have, you have to kind of work to survive in the best way that you can, make the most of your situation. You've kind of dealt a certain hand. It's kind of random in that sense. So you as the child, and you with your egocentric point of view, where you believe you are the center of everything, you have to work to get your needs met, because this goes into like the bigger idea of what it means to truly be what it means to be selfless, in a beneficial sense. Because if you're not egocentric enough and selfish enough to get your needs met, and you're just self-sacrificing, you're going to make it to where, well, you're going to get yourself to the point at which your quality of improving other people's lives, of helping other people, is going to diminish. So pretty much you're going to make this diminishing return, where because you haven't taken care of yourself, you're not going to be able to effectively take care of those around you. And that's kind of the point of this egocentric model, that when you come into the world, you seek to get these needs met and to develop, secure relationships with each other, um, with your caregivers, with your friends, whatever it may be. So that way, down the road, you know, and that way you can more efficiently help to serve others. And so that's kind of where you kind of can see the almost paradoxically the need to be selfish in a sense.
So this egocentric model helps us to understand how it is that you can uh, be you can have the set point of one of those attachments. So a way to understand this is like if you're a child and your mother is upset, you assume that your mother is upset because of something you did. Um, you can't understand that other people are in a position because of themselves and because of factors outside of your existence. And this self this egocentric worldview you have persists well into your childhood, while you're kind of making sure that your needs are being met. Because like we got into earlier, as humans, we come into the world completely dependent on those around us. We're not fully developed until we're 18. So that's 18 years of being in a position where you need to make sure that people are attending to you. You're not really in a position to help other people out. So these attachment theories come out of an egocentric worldview and a opinion that everything that happens because of you. So we kind of put it in the solar system because of that phrase of the world revolves around you. That's literally what you think as a child. You can't theorize that there's existence and factors outside of what it is to be you.
Yeah, you put it, that's well put, because the egocentric model is is crucial to like understanding how we develop and understanding why we develop the way we do and why traumatized people develop the way that they do. It goes back again to the relationships that we have with our caregivers, and we have a quote here that you can read. They shape the way our brains perceive reality. It goes much deeper than just the fact that you know they supply us with things for a certain amount of time, and then after that amount of time we are on our own, and then we repeat the pattern. It's how we interact with others as in our social lives, and how attuned we are with something I didn't mention before, how attuned we are to others. The attunement that you have with your caregivers, how you reciprocate with one another, that'll actually go on to show how well or how badly you attune to others in social scenarios. How I guess you say how calibrated your neural Wi-Fi can be, where you are able to pick up on social cues and to kind of stay in synchrony with one another. Whereas more anxious, I believe it was the anxious type he talks about, they're more sensitized to pick up on changes in body language and facial expressions, but they're not doing it to stay in sync with one another. They perceive it as threats. Mm-hmm. So they become more neurotic. Excuse me. They become more neurotic in the face of social situations.
Yeah.
So it's harder for them to integrate.
Yeah, those of us with a secure attachment pick up on these changes in facial expressions, changes in body language, and it cues us into understanding how we can better adapt to the current social scenario that we're in. But someone with one of the more severe attachments where they're anxious or disorganized,
Mm-hmm.
they're picking up on these social cues, but they're taking them as threats. So they're in this constant state of insecurity as they see the changes in facial expressions and the changes in words used, all these things that we kind of unconsciously pick up on, but it's perceived as something that's threatening to them and something that's indicative of them being unsafe. And this is it all goes back to the earliest relationships and the earliest life experiences we have as children, as our brains adapt to what we believe the world to be.
Yeah. And let me actually go back for a second. Oops. Uh, so we kind of, like we said before, you're kind of dealt you're dealt a hand, and that hand is the caregivers that you have, and so you have to structure your way to survive accordingly, and that can include being dealt a rather unfortunate hand, and being dealt into a hand of abuse, and neglect. So you have to develop strategies, develop neurological uh, wiring and firing. So you have certain mechanisms to situations where you'll respond in a certain way because you've been programmed that way. That's kind of what you've done in the past, and for better or for worse. And this is where we get into the case of Marilyn, who was a patient that Kolk had, who was a victim of incest as a child. And what was crazy about her story was, one was the fact that she couldn't even her psyche couldn't process the event so she couldn't even restore it. She couldn't shuttle it into her memory. She couldn't find a way to functionally put it into her memory. So she actually experienced dissociation as a kid, where she would leave her body during the events, and then as an adult, she couldn't remember her childhood, and she would only say that she must have had a happy childhood, even though when she submitted a drawing to Kolk, it was uh, depicting a very frightened girl, because Cole could ask her to draw uh, what she thought her childhood was like, or like a picture of her from her childhood, and it was this frightened girl, surrounded by these seemingly violent figures with this, and then there was this like huge penis that like came into the picture, and it was very um, obscene. So Cole was very confused as to it just went to show that um, she obviously didn't remember what had happened to her. Um, this picture we have here is just actually another example of a thematic apperception test. And so who sees this might think, someone who's been sexually abused might see this and conjure up a scene of sexual abuse, whereas someone else, they may say that they found out that the husband that's laying in the bed uh, has passed out, or is sick, gravely ill or something, some other scenario.
The example was that in the book was one of the young girls who had a secure attachment and who had a relatively good childhood was kind of gave it like a romantic narrative, like oh, they're having issues in their relationship, but later on they live happily ever after. It was an idea of
Yeah.
resolution and all these other things. But yeah, like you're saying, if you have a traumatic childhood, this one's less ambiguous because obviously her posture is one of sadness, but you give this to someone who's traumatized, they can come up with all sorts of reasons for this woman being sad and all sorts of horrible things that this passed out individual has done. The difference is between someone who's traumatized versus untraumatized is the untraumatized individual can use their imagination to imagine a better future. It's obvious that they have hope even in the midst of hardship, that things can get better. A traumatized individual can't do that.
Mhm. No, reorganizes your perceptions, and it, neurologically shifts the way in which you store memories. So, and in the case
Well,
of,
one thing I wanted to, we kind of jumped around a little bit, but regarding Marilyn, one thing that stood out to me was this kind of common narrative throughout the book, which is, we've mentioned it in other videos, but it's a quote from one of Kolk's earliest mentors, which was, people can't get better without knowing what they know and feeling what they feel. So
Mhm.
as Kolk kind of described the situation and the attempt at resolving this woman's issues was allowing her to remember the things that she clearly knew at some level, because her drawing depicted the childhood she had, but her conscious mind couldn't allow her to describe that to him or even know what it was. And it was a process of allowing herself to know something that she already knew and to remember memories that were accessible but were pushed out of her conscious awareness.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that it just is the highlight of like the homeostatic qualities of the psyche. Even, like, the body has homeostatic mechanisms to keep it in balance, and so does your psychology. Where if your body, if your not your body, but if your psyche can't, if you can't process an event, you can shuttle it out of your memory, because it's just like, it's almost like a built-in mechanism to try and help you maintain balance. But even though that memory didn't go anywhere, it manifested itself differently. It switched, and in the case of like in the case of incest victims, that can manifest in your immune function, which we'll get into here down the road. But
Yeah, it's Nietzsche and Freud talked about this quite a bit, how obviously you don't want to remember everything. It's one of the best faculties in some people's opinions of the psyche is, and our brain, is the ability to forget. It helps us kind of move forward, but
mm,
there's some information that you're unable to forget. You shouldn't forget your entire childhood, even if it is incredibly traumatic. Pushing entire portions of your life out of conscious view and out of your perception has a ripple effect on the rest of your psychology. So, well, while ruminating on these events is unhealthy, it's um, not knowing what happened has worse impacts, and it affects other portions of your life without necessarily understanding why. So
yeah, before we can get better, you have to know what you know and feel what you feel. You have to have the clarification of what it is. You have to combine the clarification of what you're feeling with, okay, well, how can we go about assessing that, or how can we go about making that better? So
right.
it's like the
Yeah.
blend of like a psychotherapeutic and a psychosomatic, or like a body therapy approach, um, because the two, integrating those two, the body with the mind, is going to optimize the results.
Right. Yeah. We had talked in our podcast about stress, how you can be in a position where you don't consciously feel your stress, but the physiological impacts of stress are still present. So
Mhm.
it relates back to this in terms of the body keeping the score. Like, even though you don't even though you've pushed your trauma out of your conscious view, there's still, in this case, autoimmune deficiencies, and your social life is heavily impacted. Your worldview is tainted by your earliest experiences.
Yeah, so that brings us into the next chapter, which is titled "What's Love Got to Do with It?" Because that's pretty much the perspective of like these large bodies of psychology, these large these, what's the word I'm looking for? These large scientific bodies, that produce a majority of the scientific literature, the mainstream literature of psychology. They fail to acknowledge the impacts of love and of relationships, of their quality in the manifestation of mental illness and even physical illness. The body keeps a score. That's the focus of this book. So it just goes to show again the relationships that are so crucial to these things. Here's some statistics that they included in the book. 81% of borderline personality reported childhood abuse, as young as, so a lot of them reported this at the age of 7, I believe. And people with ACE scores, which is adverse childhood experiences, as those scores rise, depression scores rise. So you see like a host of these things coming up, and Kolk had a ton of these statistics regarding the correlation of early childhood abuse and neglect with later manifestations of addictive or abusive behavior with substances, with themselves, whatever it may have been. And then this is the quote. We have a quote here that says, "By far the most important predictor of how well his subjects coped with life's inevitable disappointments was the level of security established with their primary caregiver during the first 2 years of life." That's pretty, I forgot who said that. Do you remember who said that?
No, I don't, sadly. But I mean,
It could have been Vincent Felitti.
Yeah, it's one of those things that, well, it may be kind of intuitively understood when you conduct some of these scores, like the ACE test. It's obvious that these traumatic events have this immense impact on the rest of an individual's life, not only their personality, but what kind of physical and mental illnesses they'll contract, and what kind of life they're going to experience. Because like we were getting into, if your imagination is hijacked, it's incredibly hard to cope with life events. And if you're having issues coping with life events, your success and your health are going to be impacted accordingly.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think. So, I'm sorry, I'm going back the wrong way. So, like, what do you think about? Let's see what's the question I'm trying to ask you? Like, what do you think about the relationship between like physical early adverse childhood experiences? Sorry, what do you think about the relationship between adverse childhood experiences and the correlation of like repeating those patterns as we get older? Why do you think it is that like as we experience those, why do you think it is that we repeat those patterns into like, because you think of like someone who was abused as a kid, they can either, totally flip that with their kids and, be totally loving, or they can be, they can tend to be abusive with their kids. And I think it's typically the latter.
Right. Yeah. I'm not sure what the studies say. I think I've heard both, that people are less likely to abuse their children if they were abused, or more likely? I think it's kind of, I would have to do more research on it, but I think it's kind of up in the air. I guess it would have to deal with the severity of it. But I think it does have kind of, it lessens as the generations go on. If there's a there's a book I really love. If anyone's listening at this point, check out Better Angels of Our Nature by Steven Pinker. And he kind of tracks the lineage of childhood abuse throughout culture, starting around, the 1500s, 1600s, between like what was thought of as disciplining a child was originally like burning, and then it turned into, yeah, you might like punch your kid, and then a generation down it's spanking, and then you get to our generation where it's dipped off. So I think if you grow up in a home situation where rearing a child includes physical abuse, you kind of take that worldview with you when it's time for you to have children. And you think the only way to raise this child is to discipline them physically, but you do it less so. And then your kids do it less so,
Mm-hmm.
and it's, our parents went to school at a time when in most schools the teacher could hit them. If
Yeah.
you hit a kid now in school, it's a lawsuit and a job loss. So it's nice to see. You can see the statistics, and you can graph the statistics of child abuse and the way in which it goes down through the generations. But I think it is behavior that is kind of inherited. And um, yeah, I think you tend to think that's a proper way of raising a child if that was your childhood experience.
Right. Because yeah, I was just thinking about that in relation to like neuroplasticity and epigenetics, and like um, passing those things down generations. That's one of the cool things about epigenetics is like it kind of goes back to that biblical idea of like you inherit the sins of your fathers. It's kind of showing like a biological manifestation of that. So
Yeah, when I'm reading things like this, I always think of, in my mind, I always kind of conceptualize it as societal PTSD. Like we kind of like inherit the PTSD of our caregivers, in
mm-hmm.
the way that I described, in the way that you're describing of like you look at someone raised by someone who went to war in World War I,
Mm-hmm.
and they have a worldview. The world is tough, I better toughen my kid up. And they do that by physical and verbal abuse, which they conceptualize as preparing their child for a really hard world. And then their child goes, well, the world is really tough, I should toughen my child up. And so it's kind of this progression of like you were saying, inheriting the sins of your father. Or one example, I forget the quote, is something along the lines of sparing the rod, sparing using
Spare the rod, less spoil the child,
yeah, it's
or
something along
something
those
like that.
lines
Yeah.
of yeah, get your kid in line, or um they're going to have issues down the road, and then the science comes out and it goes, no, you're just creating a child that can't cope with reality. And so especially there's a huge push towards informing parents that while you might be inclined to discipline a child with a good whack, it's not conducive to a mentally healthy individual down the road. You're creating an insecure attachment or a disorganized attachment.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, it's kind of those tricky things because yeah, like children are so they've learned physically, like because like we said, the way in which a child's held really determines how they feel in their bodies, and that can so that can have the same implications with physical um, physical retribution, or not retribution, but physical punishment. So yeah, it's 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 definitely, yeah, it's an interesting topic nonetheless to
Yeah.
continue to like get into, especially when as the research continues to develop. But anyways, going on, these are a couple of examples that Colt gave in rats and in rhesus monkeys, showing how, you know, these things instantiate neurologically. Like with rats that were licked more as pups, they had a greater functioning hippocampi, which is plural for hippocampus, that part of the brain that's important for registering memories, and it works in relation to a host of other regions of the brain. Like we talked about it, we mentioned it before in the past podcast or the past book review with the cook and the smoke detector and the watchtower. You can go back and watch that. We talked about that a little bit there too, and they just showed similar developmental traits in humans, like especially in the rhesus monkeys. And I know you had some things you want to talk about interesting from the rhesus monkeys.
Yeah, it was the study was including the study was regarding their alcohol abuse. I don't know if anyone knows this, but if you give a rhesus monkey alcohol, they will in fact enjoy themselves. The difference between the two is their mother, which is so if the mother was a certain kind had a certain kind of disciplining tactic, if it was anxious and kind of fearful, and it was somewhat abusive towards its child, as the child grew, the 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 monkey would drink until it went unconscious, while in other forms of attachment theory, in the monkey would uh, kind of just drink to numb itself. It wouldn't go till it was incapacitated. And so this is correlated obviously with humans and their substance abuse issues. The trauma impacts the degree to which they will abuse a substance or the intensity of the substance used. Um, yeah, it's interesting to look at kind of these lower primates that have less of a prefrontal cortex, and kind of less going on in their head, and they're exhibiting the same kinds of behavior.
It
This
shows you how it's like how instantiated this is across mammals,
mm,
because like mammals are very social, beings.
Right. Yeah, this with the um, rat example, this was the pups licked within, I think it was 12 seconds of their birth. So they're coming into the world and they're going like, okay, how should I respond to my environment? Oh, my mom is taking care of me and I'm loved and I'm safe. Therefore, down the road, I can understand that I'm loved and that, the world is a safe place. Whereas if the mother is stressed out or the mother is not in tune, even to its rat pups, there's still a response to reality of this is a dangerous place to be. I should be fearful of the future right now.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And then those experiences, that not having that care in such that amount of time, that affected their neurological development, which in fact, and also that affected their epigenetic markers,
Mhm.
um, and so it would affect how they express themselves in the world, both physically and emotionally.
Right. Another example of the monkeys and regarding, if you want to go back, the traits that you get regarding early behavior, it was something along the lines of taking a child away from a mother, or in another example, a mother who is abusive towards its child. When they study these animals, and they put them in an environment with other animals, they can't adapt socially. They don't play well with others. They don't respond to their own children in the same way. They are um, they have this imprint of their earliest experiences. Their brain molds to the experience that they had in childhood, and they respond accordingly throughout the rest of their life.
Yeah, it's like the I thought of this. It's like the Matthew. Well, I didn't think of this, but the Matthew principle. Obviously, it comes from the Bible, the book of Matthew, where um, Jesus says, to those who have more, more will be given, and those who have less, more will be taken. Essentially, so it's like the better you have it early on, or like the like more secure attachment you have early on. In this case, the easier it's going to be for you to be socially integrated in the world, and so that'll just make your circumstances in life that much easier. Whereas the opposite is also true. Whereas you have a hard time when you're younger, it's just going to make it that much harder for you to be socially integrated, which is going to make it harder for you to find a job, which is going to make it harder for you to make money to keep yourself well fed, which is going to keep you malnourished, which is going to inhibit your physiological function, your brain development, and you can just see how it cascades.
Right.
So
it's something so wonderful about the growing field of psychology is like, yes, if you have if you have hardship earlier on in life, yes, the rest of your life is going to be hard, but we're discovering ways in which you can counteract and counterbalance those earlier adverse experiences, which is the blessing of having a malleable brain. It's like, yeah, your brain is less malleable as you age, but it's still incredibly plastic. And with with the combination of an understanding of neuroplasticity and clinical psychology, we're learning to kind of reset the way in which an individual perceives reality. So even if you didn't hit the genetic lottery and you weren't, your mother had postpartum depression and wasn't able to attune to your needs at an earlier at an earlier stage in your life, you can kind of rewire your brain now, and you can, with a lot of effort and with a lot of understanding, you can still be as happy as an individual who hit that genetic lottery. So it's really, I mean, as sad as some of these stories are in this book of people with a history of trauma and parents who were not fit to be caregivers, there's a lot of success stories, and it's really heartwarming to see people overcome these horrific experiences. And it just shows the resilience of the human mind and the human spirit, that they can take what they were given and make more of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's like you were saying with developing psychology and developing scientific fields, in even with the understanding, the growing ability of our conscious, minds, that's where the power of our mindset, of mentality comes into play, and how we can actually use our internal self-talk to affect gene expression, affect physiological functioning. And that's one of the crazy things about newly emerging science. It's like, yeah, we're learning, like you said, we're learning how to become the arbiters of our own destiny, like whatever that may be. We have the ability to choose where we want to go more and more. But it's still nonetheless important to have that observation of of how it typically plays out in nature, And so what we're doing is building on top of these structures, and becoming aware of them is especially important, because once you become aware of this, like, Matthew principle, so to speak, you become aware of how important it is that children that they're taken care of at an early age, and how important this is, how it really lies at the root of so many things in society, not just in our families, but as it plays out in society. Because a well-functioning family is the root of a society. Here we have some more examples of the body keeping the score. You see in Marilyn's case, we talked about Marilyn earlier. She had impaired, she wasn't involved in the study, but women similar to her who had incest history, they had this abnormally large ratio of immune cells, where essentially they were geared, they had a heightened immune response to their environment, but it was a heightened response from these RA cells, these CD45 RA cells, which are like memory cells from your immune system, and um, they code for past toxins, past threats to face them again. Whereas RO, the CD45 RO cells are preparing for novel threats. The reason why it's large is because their traumatic experience in the past has caused them to become more sensitive to their environment, and that includes their immunity as well. So you can see even how your immune function is involved in this as well. And you can see Vincent Felides, what he found in his study from Kaiser Permanente when they implemented these 10 additional questions to the questionnaires for application, for applying to Kaiser Permanente to get medicated. You can see the ACE scores, which is ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experience. If you had a score of 6 or above compared to 0, you had a 15% greater chance of suffering from some of the top leading causes of death in the U.S. And you just see the proclivity of physical ailment coming from these things, including obesity. And so with that, you can also think of, okay, well, if all of these, so many of these pathologies stem from, physical and mental, stem from trauma and from our relationships, then why not fix those instead of trying to go to other sources to try and put a band-aid on these things, just trying to heal the symptoms, while in the meantime we go back and repeat those same patterns and go back into those same environments.
Right. Yeah. It just becomes so obvious understanding these things, the societal implications of attending to your community. We'll get into the implications of these statistics and how we can go about setting up a world that's better than the one that we currently reside in. Because if we're going about trying to figure out how to cure heart disease without understanding that this heart disease has its root in a childhood experience that could have been solved if it was for a better public school system, or better access to help in a household that needed help, then we wouldn't have this huge epidemic of heart disease. It's simple as that. Like we talk so much about the obesity rates in America, but this chapter was titled "The Hidden Epidemic," because we don't talk about the correlation between obesity and childhood sexual abuse. It's something that we don't want to talk about the individual's past. We want to talk about what kind of medication we can take to cure the individual now. When in reality, these things are so heavily correlated, and it's so sad to see them ignored to the extent that they're ignored in, and not to appreciate the role that trauma plays in the unhealthiness and the rate of disease and the rate of mental illness even that is prevalent in our societies right now.
Yeah, and it's not just something, and it is, you're right, it is sad to see that, but eventually, like, with this body of knowledge, like, at some point a failure to acknowledge that is going to be a form of malpractice. Mm-hmm. It's like you're ignoring the data and you're ignoring what it is that really lies, like how we can cure these things more effectively. And so you're not truly helping people in that sense anymore, unless you continue to inquire on the true nature of these things through scientific studies, through scientific interventions, but also through intuitions and understanding that, as our development as children, and our relationships we develop with others, family and friends, that is going to be crucial for so many things in our lives. whether that be social, whether it be relationships or our physical health, Um, so yeah, it's crucial to understand these things.
That's really
The root cause of things, huh?
that's really well put. Yeah, it's I think
But
from
we can actually get into the DSM
oh that
DSM about this now, because
idea.
this ties in exactly like where these ideas of root cause, of getting to the root of these things, aren't really considered in like the mainstream of psychology literature.
Right. Yeah. So while the book was being written, Kolk was conducting some of these studies in order to prove a correlation between trauma and mental health issues, which it's amazing that you would even have to prove that correlation. But the people that are creating these DSMs apparently don't recognize that correlation as scientifically sound. They don't believe that you can take something like adverse childhood experience and map that onto bipolar personality disorder or anxiety and depression. They just don't have that inside the disease model of psychology. They don't have that worldview that trauma and mental health issues are heavily correlated. It's very much centered around the chemicals and a malfunctioning brain rather than uh, the world experiences of an individual, the society that they're in, the relationships that they have. These things are discounted when it comes to diagnosing.
Yeah,
And
diagnosing that's something, that's another section of this book he has with talking about the DSM is like, and we talked about this before with the DSM-5, is like this growing inclusivity of these so many different forms of diagnosing people. And what Kolk doesn't like about this, and what he talks about it is, it's kind of like a laziness on the part of the practitioners to diagnose children who may have just who may have had a traumatic experience as a child, or had a bad relationship with their caregivers. They were neglected or abused. They're obviously going to be dysfunctional in some sense, and so they get latent with I'm sorry, they get uh, covered with these pseudoscientific, as Colt calls them, these pseudoscientific diagnoses of like operational defiance syndrome, for example, which pretty much just means like you're annoying and you don't do what you say, you don't do what you're told. Um, you know, that's not a diagnosis. That's not a medical diagnosis, but the power of the diagnosis is that you have this, now you have this thing that you like want to identify with, that you try to, it becomes like a part of you. And given like the power of like nocebo and placebo that we've also talked about in a previous podcast, it shows, it makes it that much harder on these kids and on people in general to make themselves better and heal themselves, and to see the power that they actually have in making themselves able to change their circumstances and to heal from their past.
right, yeah, it becomes a sort of an identity that
Mm-hmm.
like I have this, therefore I act like this, and because there is uh, there's issues in terms of healing because it's so hard to go about true healing, especially if you're just trying to use medication outside of medication and clinical therapy in order to heal the issue. There's um, it kind of we've spoken in other but in other chapters about how it kind of takes the free will out of the individual. The individual doesn't recognize that they have the capacity to change in some certain circumstances. This isn't, we're kind of painting with a large brush here, but
Yeah.
yeah, there's very much an identification with a disease and a lack of understanding that the disease and the trauma are heavily correlated, and you can heal and move on from trauma, where and you don't need to carry your disease with you throughout your life.
Right. Yeah. Now I only have about, probably like a little under 10 minutes now, so we're gonna have to try and get through these last few slides. So, um, but that isn't. It's important to highlight this because this is showing like the DSM-5 is a very, the DSM itself is very. It's like a standard in psychology for like, all mental health practitioners, all lawyers, and other professions have to have this book. Um, and also Kolk also pointed out that this book, DSM-4, accrued over $100 billion in revenue. So he also, there's also that financial incentive that can be behind, publishing, making new publications, and it's showing that this isn't all entirely based upon in the pursuit to heal people.
Mm.
But anyways, going forward, let's go back. So let's try and have like a bit of a recap where, we see beginning with the development between development between caregivers, the relationships you have early on in your childhood that affects you physiologically in your brain. It affects you as an individual, how you talk to yourself, how you relate to yourself, and what genetic markers you have expressed, and how your immune system functions. We talked about that as well. And then that carries over into how you relate to others, your social life, the friends that you have, or the friends that you have trouble making, because you had an abusive parents, and so that made it harder to deal with people, and so you kind of shuttled yourself off, or people perceived you as weird, which made it harder for you to make friends. So you can see the implications there, and that carries over into your workplace and just in general being able to work with others. We as humans would not have been able to accomplish the feats we have as a civilization without that ability to work with others, and that's just, it's so encoded into us to work with others, to be in the company of others. And so it's just so important. And then beyond that, we have just the quality of our societies is dependent upon this first process. It kind of happens in a cycle, in a sense, where we are born into this life, into this relation, into this family, into a family, or maybe you're not born into a family, and maybe that you experience that early on, like lack of caregiving, and so it carries over into your relationships, into your workplace, and into the society, and how you contribute to it, and how you may shape it for better or for worse. And so, and it just goes out and affects everything, so if we can understand how trauma really works, we can make the world better. And so here's some like really cool things he talks about that can affect the economics of this, and how much we're overlooking trauma, in Kolk's perspective, where we can save, so much money in welfare, healthcare costs, drug treatments, jailing, incarceration, just from making home life and making the lives of children more connected, and overall more loving, and more nurturing.
Yeah, and these are things that other countries are beginning to implement, because you can measure the ripple effect so easily. Instead of paying X amount of dollars for incarceration, you can have programs in place to help people in at-risk communities. And instead of looking at substance abuse as some kind of failure on the individual, you can have home visits in the communities where nurses come by and help train mothers, and you can make life at home less fueled by anxiety in regard to the economic implications of not having the right job. And you can take these steps in order to make life for the individual easier, therefore reducing trauma in the community.
Yeah, and this is, if you're going to take, as a listener, if you're listening, if you're going to take anything out of this, I would say this is it, where we've kind of tried to build this up to show how important it is to invest in our relationships with people and invest in, um, bringing people into this world and caring for them and giving them a loving environment. It goes beyond just that individual. That individual will affect other people and other individuals, and those individuals will affect other individuals, and it just trickles down. And that's how it is with anything. That's the idea of the butterfly effect, where one thing, everything is affected by everything. Everything is in relation to something else. It's a much more unified and integral way, a holistic way of looking at how the human functions. It's a bio-psycho-social creature. It's like the new field of biopsychal sociology, or however you want to term it. It's these growing fields are like seeking to integrate more and more different aspects of medicine, like psychoneuroendocrinology. There's psychoneuroendoimmunology. That's like kind of how the body, or how the mind affects the body, and it's this growing need to unify things, and this is one way how you do it. Anyone who's interested in this, can listen to people like Johan Hari, who is invested in fixing drug treatments across the world, and like how and just interested in learning and observing how different methods to go about treating addiction, how in places like Sweden, I believe, and maybe I think Denmark even, the drug addiction has plummeted, even despite the fact they've legalized all drugs,
Right.
all narcotics. And it's just amazing to show, because they take quality time in, they spend their money in investing in the quality of caring for children, making sure their needs are met, of developing quality relationships.
Right. Yeah. If you develop a more secure, mentally healthy, happier child, you build a better society. You have a better economy. You have less disease, less obesity, less substance abuse. It's stupid not to, is what we're getting at.
Essentially.
These not caring for the individual has a huge impact on the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't think I don't think anyone, any one person listening to this would definitely agree with that. It's more just a fact of, like, I don't know. It goes. It's almost like people don't have the they don't have the foresight to kind of see that how this, like, all this trickles down or cascades, or it's the fact that they need something outside of themselves. That could be one possible mechanism, just given our heavily materialistic society, where we totally believe on things external of us to heal us, like the chemical pharmaceutical interventions, for example. So, but that's just my speculations. Is there anything else you want to add before we close up?
We covered it, man.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. I'm actually going to have to head off here soon. Sorry to dart so fast on you like that.
It was plenty long for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks for tuning in, guys.
Yeah. Take care.